On the death of Shamsuddin Muhammad, king of Persia, Shariar, his eldest son, succeeded to the throne. This prince, though hasty and violent in his temper, had many virtues. He had the truest affection for his youngest brother, Shah Zenan, and on receiving the empire, instead of suffering him to languish in obscurity, he gave his beloved brother the powerful kingdom of Great Tartary, and sent him to take possession of it with a splendor suitable to the dignity of a mighty and independent prince. After an absence of 10 years, the royal brothers had a great desire to see each other, and the king of Tartary, at the earnest request of Shariar, resolved to pay him a visit. He accordingly began his journey with a suitable equipage, but as the arranging so large a retinue prevented his advancing far the first day, he returned privately in the evening to his palace to take another farewell of his queen, whom he passionately loved. On entering her apartment suddenly, with the hope of giving her an agreeable surprise, he was shocked to find her sleeping in the arms of a slave. Overcome with rage, the king drew his saber and deprived them both of life. He then returned to his pavilion, and though oppressed with the keenest sorrow, he determined to pursue his journey. When Shahzaman arrived at the capital of Persia, the sultan received him with open arms. But a deep melancholy had seized the unfortunate king of Tartary, which all the efforts of his brother could not overcome. In vain did the court of Persia exhibit all of its splendor. Shahzaman remained gloomy and insensible. On a sudden, without any apparent cause, this sadness disappeared, and he became again, all at once, the same sprightly companion and affectionate brother whom Sharhiar had so tenderly loved before their separation. The Sultan of Persia rejoiced exceedingly at this alteration, but he was also much surprised at it. No cause appeared for the sorrow which had bowed down his brother. No reason could be conjectured why it should so suddenly leave him. As soon, therefore, as Sharhiar found that the king was effectually recovered, he became importunate for an explanation of the mystery. Shahzaman made no difficulty of acquainting his brother with the infidelity of his queen, but entreated him to cease inquiring why he had shaken off the sorrow which her baseness had occasioned. The sultan became alarmed, and judging by the reluctance of his brother that he was somehow interested in the affair, he adjured the king of Tartary to hide nothing from him. Shahzaman was obliged to comply. He requested the sultan would indulge him only till the next day, and would order the court to prepare for a grand hunting match to take place then. Shahriar complied, and as further instructed by his brother, he left his train and returned privately to the king of Tartary's apartments, where there was a closet which overlooked the gardens of the sultaness. Shahzaman had from thence accidentally observed several interviews between that lady and a favored gallant, and from thence the sultan also became a witness of his own dishonor and of his wife's incontinence. "It was this unhappy secret," said Shahzaman, "which removed my despondency, as so amiable a man as my brother could not secure to himself the possession of a woman. It convinced me that the whole sex were contaminated, and that it would be idle in me any longer to bewail so common a misfortune." The sultan instantly sacrificed his guilty wife and her paramour. being overwhelmed with affliction, proposed to his brother that they should renounce the world, retire to some obscure hermitage, and finish their lives without being further exposed to the treachery of women. Shahzaman did not think it prudent to oppose the first transports of his brother's rage and grief. He gave in to his proposal with great apparent readiness, but exacted a promise from him that he would return to his capital and reassume his throne whenever they should meet with anyone more unfortunate in female connections than themselves. The princes, having disguised themselves, left the city secretly and traveled till evening, when they arrived at the seaside. At daybreak, they were alarmed by a frightful noise from the sea, and had scarce time to climb up into a tree when they perceived a large column arise in the midst of the water, and advance toward the shore. They presently found it was one of those malignant genii who are enemies to mankind and always doing them mischief. He was black, terrific, and appeared like a giant of prodigious stature. He carried on his head a great glass box which shut with four locks. Having laid his box down, he seated himself by it and opened it, when there came out a beautiful lady, magnificently dressed. She sat down by the monster, who said to her in a voice of tenderness, "My charming mistress, whom I stole on your wedding day, and have loved with so much constancy ever since, let me repose a while by you. I came hither on purpose to take rest." Having spoke thus, he laid down his huge head on the lady's knees and fell asleep. When the genie's mistress perceived that he was so, she raised his head from her lap and laid it on the earth. She then got up and went to the glass chest, and taking out a large string of rings, she counted them over and examined them with much attention. Then turning toward the genie, who was still asleep, she exclaimed aloud, "Fool, to think that jealousy and restraint can preserve a mistress! Notwithstanding thy vigilance, I find by these rings, every one of which I have received from a different gallant, that I have had 80 lovers since I have been in thy power." The princess continued in the tree till the genie awoke, who, having replaced the lady in the chest and locked it up, took it again on his head and returned into the sea. When he had been gone a considerable time, they descended, and the sultan, being convinced that the genie was more unfortunate than himself, yielded to the persuasions of his brother, returned to his capital, and resumed his government. After some time, the king of Tartary choosing to return home, the sultan dismissed him with every mark of fraternal love, and on his departure said to him, "I have at length fallen upon a method to preserve the chastity of a wife. I will not now," added he, "explain myself. You will, no doubt, shortly hear of it, and I question not but you will follow my example." Soon after the departure of Shahzaman, the sultan chose the daughter of one of his nobles for his bride. The nuptial ceremony was performed. The lady passed her night with her royal bridegroom, and in the morning the grand vizier received her from his hand, with orders to put her to death immediately. Every night now saw a new bride conducted to the sultan's bed, and every morning beheld the victim to his jealousy. The consternation was universal. There was no parent who had a young and beautiful daughter but trembled for her life, and the sultan, instead of receiving as before the blessing of his people, became the object of their execrations. The implicit obedience which good Mussulmans owe to the commander of the faithful had as yet restrained the inhabitants of Baghdad from rebellion, nor had they taken any measure to preserve their children from so new a calamity. When the beauteous and accomplished Sherazad, daughter of the Grand Vizier, undertook to deliver them from it by becoming the destined bride. Her father was astonished when she declared her design. He used every argument and entreaty to persuade her from it, and agreeably to the custom of the East, he endeavored to enforce his reasoning by the following apologue: The ox, the ass, and the farmer. There lived in a certain country a very wealthy farmer, whose lands were cultivated with the greatest care, and abounded with all sorts of cattle and poultry. It so happened that he had an opportunity to render essential service to a very powerful genie, who in return, at the farmer's request, endowed him with the faculty of understanding the language of all animals, but on this express condition, that he should never interpret it to anyone on pain of death. Some time after this event, the farmer was walking leisurely in his yard when he heard the following conversation between an ox and an ass. "Sprightly," said the ox, "how much do I envy your condition! You have no labor except now and then to carry our master little journeys, in return for which you are well fed with the best corn, carefully cleaned, and lodged in fresh straw every night, while I, who works from daylight till dark, and I am urged by the blows of the plowman to toil almost beyond my strength, when my hard task is performed, am scantily supplied with coarse food, and pass the night on the common." "Those," replied the ass, "who call you a foolish beast are not much mistaken. Why do you not, with all that strength, exert a little courage, and resist such ill treatment? If they give you a bad corn, smell at it and leave it, and when they are about to fasten you to the plough, bellow aloud, stamp with your foot, and even strike them with your horns. Be assured, a little resolution will soon procure you better treatment." The farmer, having heard this conversation, was not long in coming to a resolution. The next morning, the laborer found the ox restive when he attempted to yoke at him, on which, by his master's orders, he left him, and, putting the collar on the ass, he fixed him to the plough, and with many blows compelled him to perform the work the ox should have done. Nor was this all, for when he returned at night, more dead than alive, he found no straw to lie on, and instead of a plentiful supply of the best oats, there was nothing in his manger but a handful of coarse beans, ill cleansed, which even his extreme hunger could scarcely prevail with him to eat. The ox, who had rested the whole day and been fed with the provender usually given to his companion, received him on his return with many compliments and avowals of obligation. To these ceremonies the ass had no relish. Without answering a word, he threw himself on the ground, and in thought began to upbraid his own folly. "Was I ever such imprudence as mine?" said he within himself. "How has this silly officiousness undone me? What had I to wish for that I did not enjoy? When did sorrow ever approach me? All this happiness I have deservedly lost by meddling with that which did not concern me." The Grand Vizier applied the obvious moral to Sherazad, but finding she persisted, he became angry. "If you will continue thus obstinate," said he, "you will oblige me to treat you in the same manner the farmer did his wife in the sequel of the story." The farmer, hearing that the ass was in bad plight, was curious to know what would pass between him and the ox. Accordingly, after supper, he took a walk with his wife into the yard, when he heard the sufferer say to his companion, "Comrade, what do you intend to do tomorrow when the laborer brings you meat?" "Do, my best friend," replied the ox. "Why, I will carefully attend to your instructions. If my corn is not of the best quality, I will not deign to touch it, and if he presumes to lay a halter on me, I will not fail to knock him down." "I fancy," replied the ass, "you will think it prudent to alter that resolution when I relate to you that I heard our master say to the laborer just now." The ass, having thus excited the attention and fear of the ox, told him very gravely that the farmer had ordered his servant, if the ox continued restive, to knock him on the head the day following and distribute his flesh among the poor. The ox, alarmed at his story, bellowed aloud for fear, and vowed submission to the laborer, which resolution that ass was forward to command. The farmer was so pleased with the cunning of the ass and the terrors of the ox that he burst into an immoderate fit of laughter. His wife, who saw no reason for this extraordinary mirth, was curious to know the cause of it. He tried to evade her question, but the more he sought to divert her attention, the more earnest she became in her inquiry. At length, tired with her importunity, he told her that the cause of his laughing must continue a secret. "You will not, I suppose," added he, "urge me any further when I acquaint you that my revealing it would certainly cost me my life." This assertion, which she affected not to believe, made the wife redouble her importunities. The farmer, however, continued resolute, and suffered her to pass the night in tears without much concern. But when he found next day that the same obstinate desire of the fatal information continued, he was exceedingly distressed. He called in the assistance of his neighbors and relations, who in vain represented to her the unreasonableness of her request. She persisted, and the unhappy farmer was on the point of gratifying her at the expense of his life, when an incident determined him to alter his intention. Going out of his door, he heard his faithful dog relating with concern the story of his embarrassment to a cock, who heard it with much contempt. "A pretty fellow, truly," replied the cock, "is this master of ours, who cannot manage one wife when I govern 50. Let him take a good crapstick and use it properly. I will engage she will soon dismiss her impertinent curiosity." The honest farmer took the hint. His wife returned to her duty, and you, my daughter, if treated in the same manner, would no doubt be as comfortable to my desires, and forego so desperate an experiment. Notwithstanding this, and every other method taken to shake her determination, Sherazad continued unmoved, and the Grand Vizier was obliged to announce to his sovereign the ambition of his daughter. The Sultan heard him with surprise. After pausing for a few moments, he said to him with an air of severity, "I give you opportunity to recall this rash offer. If you persist in it, I will receive Sherazad as my wife. But presume not to hope that I will violate my vow in her favor. On the contrary, your own life as well as hers shall be forfeited if you hesitate for a moment to execute my usual orders." Even this menace had no effect on the young lady, and the unhappy father was compelled to lead his darling child to the arms of his sovereign, with the full assurance of being obliged to deprive her of life with his own hands the following morning. When Sherazad was introduced to the Sultan, he was struck with her beauty and modest sensibility. Perceiving her in tears, he for a moment forgot his barbarous resolution and endeavored to comfort her. The lovely sultaness, pleased to see she had made an impression on his savage heart, seized that moment to request that her sister, Dinarzade, might be admitted to her next morning, an hour before day, to take her last farewell. The sultan readily complied, and notice being sent to her sister accordingly, the charming Sherazad suffered herself to be conducted to the fatal couch, and became the devoted bride to the cruel Sharhiar. At the appointed hour, Dinarzade was admitted to the nuptial chamber, when she made the strange request that in the little time which remained before they were to part forever, the sultaness would relate to her one of those many entertaining stories she had read. The sultan, wondering at so singular a request, consented, at the desire of his bride, and even expressed a wish to hear stories which must be singular indeed to be asked for at such a moment. Sherazad, encouraged by this wish, began thus: The Merchant and the Genie. Sir, there was formerly a merchant whose extensive traffic obliged him to travel to many places, in one of which journeys, finding himself much incommoded by the heat of the day, he alighted from his horse and sat down in a shady grove. When taking some dates out of his portmanteau, he ate them, throwing the shells on each side of him. When he had done eating, being a good Mussulman, he washed his hands and feet at an adjoining rivulet and said his prayers. While he was yet on his knees, a monstrous genie, all white with age, advanced toward him with a scimitar in his hand, and uttering a frightful cry, exclaimed, Rise up, that I might kill thee, as thou hast killed my son. The merchant, terrified as much at his appearance as his threats, protested his innocence. How? Exclaimed the genie. Did you not even now throw about the shells of your date? My son was passing by, and you threw one of them into his eye, which killed him. Therefore I must kill thee. Saying which, he took the merchant by the arm, threw him on the ground, and lifted up the scimitar to cut off his head. In this imminent danger, the merchant earnestly entreated permission to return home and settle his affairs, and take leave of his family. What time do you require? Said the genie. I ask a year, replied the merchant. I swear by Allah that this day 12 months I will return under these trees to put myself into your hands. Upon this the genie disappeared. The merchant returned home, disconsolate. He employed the allotted time in properly regulating his affairs, and when it was near expired, he took a sorrowful leave of his family, and arrived at the place where he had promised to meet the genie. While he was waiting for his dreaded approach, he saw two old men coming toward him with different quarters. The first leading a hind, the second two black dogs. They approached the trees where the unfortunate merchant was sitting, when one of them said to him, Brother, why do you stay in this place? Do you not know that a number of evil spirits resort to it, and that it is by no means safe to continue here? Alas, said the merchant, I know that but too well. He then related his story to the old men, who, having heard it, agreed to continue with him until the genie should appear. In a little time they perceived a thick vapor advancing toward them, which vanishing all at once discovered the genie. Without noticing the old man, he took the merchant by the arm, saying, Rise, that I may kill thee as thou didst kill my son." The merchant filled the air with his cries, and the old men, prostrating themselves on the ground, entreated for him. The genie, with some difficulty, was persuaded to listen to their expostulations, and at length to agree that if their several adventures were more surprising than that of the merchant, he would relent and set him at liberty. Day advancing, the sultan arose, and the vizier, in much affliction, entered into his presence in full expectation of receiving the usual fatal orders. But the sultan was so much taken with the beauty and accomplishments of his lady, and his curiosity was so much excited by the interesting story she had begun, that he became irresolute respecting his vow, and talking to his trembling vizier on other affairs, he left him in suspense, also as to the fate of his beloved daughter. The next morning, Sherazad resumed her narrative with the history of the old man and the hind. "I married," began the first old man, "in my early life, my cousin, with whom I lived more than 20 years in much happiness. The only thing that abated it was that we had no children. The desire of posterity induced me to buy a slave, by whom I shortly had a son. I still lived in great harmony with my wife, who always treated the slave kindly, and appeared to be very fond of my boy. Some years after his birth, I was obliged to go a long journey, and on my return, my wife told me that my son and my slave were both dead. I lamented their loss very much, but the feast of Bahrain approaching, I thought it my duty to overcome my sorrow and prepare for the holy festival. Accordingly, I gave orders to my farmer to bring up one of the fattest cows to sacrifice at the commencement of the solemnity. He obeyed, but when the cow was brought to me, she bellowed piteously, and I could perceive tears run down from her eyes. Struck with so singular a spectacle, and moved, I knew not how, I was about to send the cow back and order another, when my wife opposed any exchange with great vehemence. I suffered myself to be prevailed on, and though I could not kill her myself, I ordered my farmer to do so, who obeyed me. When she was slain, it was found, notwithstanding her plump appearance, that she was mere skin and bone, and wholly unfit for the intended sacrifice. I immediately sent for another fat beast, and the farmer brought a calf whose behavior was still more extraordinary. He broke the cord, ran to me, and fell at my feet. I determined to listen to the impulse I felt in favor of this calf. I accordingly ordered him to be taken back, although my wife interfered with still great eagerness, and insisted that he should be slaughtered. The day following, my farmer desired to speak with me alone. He took me to his own habitation and introduced me to his daughter. By her, I was informed that during my journeys my wife had learned the black art, and by that means had transformed my slave into the cow we had unfortunately slaughtered the day before, and my son into the calf which had so narrowly escaped. I leave you to judge, powerful genie, how much I was distressed at this account. But no doubting my informer was able to restore my son, as she had the skill to discover his situation. I very earnestly besought her assistance. "On two conditions," replied she. "I will restore him first, that you give him me for a husband, and secondly, that you permit me to punish as she deserves the wicked enchantress who has transformed him." I consented. She then pronounced certain words, and sprinkling my son with water, he resumed his shape. He joyfully married his fair benefactress, who changed my wicked wife into the hind you see here. The story of the old man with the two black dogs. Prince Genie, said the second old man, these dogs and myself are brothers. On the death of our father, we divided his substance among us, and each received 1,000 sequins. One of my brothers resolved to travel, laid out his money in goods suited to the country he intended to visit, and departed. After a year's absence, he returned in great distress, having lost all his effects. Meantime, by industry, I had acquired an additional 1,000 sequins, which I readily gave him. My other brother, not disheartened by the ill success of the first, pursued the same measures. Very shortly he also returned, entirely ruined. To him also I gave another 1,000 sequins. We then agreed to remain at home and pursue our business carefully without seeking further adventures. Some years afterwards, both my brothers besought me to join with them in a trading voyage. Their importunity prevailed. I disposed of my stock, which now produced 6,000 sequins, half of which I buried in a corner of the house, and gave each of my brothers 1,000 sequins of the remainder. We arrived safely at our destined port, where we sold our adventures to good profit. When we were nearly ready to return, I met on the bank of the sea a lady, handsome but poorly clad, who very earnestly persuaded me to marry her. I consented, and having taken her on board the vessel, we set sail. My wife proved to be possessed of so many good qualities that I became every day more fond of her. My unworthy brothers, envying my superior good fortune, seized us both while asleep and threw us into the sea. But little did these bad men imagine the punishment that awaited their cruelty and ingratitude. My wife was a fairy. She conveyed me home and conducted the vessel, which had my goods on board, safe into port. Before I knew of its arrival, 2 black dogs came crouching to me in the most submissive manner. "These," said the fairy, "are your brothers, thus in their wickedness requited, and it is one part of their punishment that in this degraded state they must look for support and protection to the brother they so basely betrayed." The genie thought these adventures so singular that he remitted the punishment of the merchant and disappeared, and the merchant, after suitably thanking his benefactors, returned home again with joy to his family. The sultan was delighted with these stories. He requested Sherazad to proceed next night to another, and going into the divan, the vizier, his family, the court, and the people in general were overjoyed to find that he gave no orders to put the beautiful sultaness to death.